Hello and welcome to this first session of the e-learning module on researching crisis and disasters, a historical overview and selected methodological issues. Bianca Villar here again, PhD candidate from La Salle Universitat Ramon Llull in Barcelona, Spain. In this section, we will discuss two interrelated points. First, I will provide a historical snapshot of the evolution of disaster and crisis research. In the second part, we will zoom into the interchanging use of two terms, crisis and disaster, and tackle the implications this might have in developing research in this domain. The first known systematic inquiry on disaster dates back to the work of Samuel Prince about the Halifax explosion that occurred in 1917. This work, Catastrophe and Social Change, came in completion as a PhD dissertation in the School of Sociology in Columbia University. While his work now includes some outdated theories about disasters, the work is important as it is known to be the first documentation of collective behavior in disaster contexts, which is later used as a springboard for other scholars of disaster research. A decade later, another scholar, Lowell Juilliard Carr from the University of Michigan, tied the study of disaster with social change, arguing that a disaster occurs not because of a catastrophe, but because of the collapse of a social system. This is considered a crucial characteristic because it delimits the definition of a disaster as occurring only when certain social systems are affected. For example, a catastrophe, like an earthquake, a flood, or the collapse of a building, is not considered a disaster if it does not affect a social system. Now, interestingly, while the studies of Samuel Prince and Lowell Juilliard Carr set the stage for a systematic study of disasters, the area has not been populated until after the Second World War in the 1950s. This was followed by the establishment of the first social science research center devoted to the study of disasters, housed in the Ohio State University in 1963. The center moved to the University of Delaware in 1985 as a disaster research center. The center has since grown from a group of sociology-trained scholars to a more interdisciplinary group, including those who have trained in the areas of geography, engineering, history, organizational studies, and communication studies, among others. The center is presently complemented by other research centers that are specialized in certain disciplines across the globe. It's not unlikely for one to ask how different or how similar the research outputs have been throughout the years. After all, it's been approximately half a century since the establishment of the first known disaster research center in the field of social sciences. The E.L. Quarantelli Resource Center in the University of Delaware alone is a custodian of over 60,000 volumes of research. This does not include other research outputs that are collated by other research centers. It's therefore interesting to see how these outputs compare in terms of theme, and perspective. How have the topics covered evolved through the years? Professor Ronald Perry, in his chapter contribution to the Handbook of Disaster Research, pointed out three distinct phases in the development of disaster research. We're going to be seeing them in the next few slides. Some scholars ascribe to the classical period, where the perspective is reflective of the post-World War II era. Here, scholars focus on human behavior and on the way that a society copes with situations that depart from a pattern of normal expectations. The next phase is known as the hazards perspective. Focus here has shifted from human behavior in chaos to an agent-centered approach. The agent is the extreme event that affects people. Scholars informed by this phase centered on understanding the nature of hazards, for example, typhoon, tornadoes, and earthquakes. The last of the identified phases adheres to the perspective of disaster as a social phenomenon. In this phase, scholars try to strengthen the conceptual foundations of disaster management. Taxonomies and theoretical grounding have been revisited, primary of which is understanding what exactly do we mean by a disaster, and how is this related to another synonymous concept, which is crisis. The terms crisis and disaster have been used interchangeably in common settings. However, researchers take caution against the potential implications of using one term over the other. The resulting approach to the research framework usually depends on whether the researcher perceives the situation as a disaster or as a crisis. Arjan Boyn, professor of the Public Institutions and Governance at the Institute of Political Science in Leiden University, provides the following distinction. A crisis is when a community of people perceives an urgent threat to the core values of life-sustaining functions, which must be dealt with under conditions of uncertainty. Meanwhile, A disaster is an episode that is collectively construed as very harmful. If we think about it, there are two dimensions here. First, the time at which either a crisis or a disaster occurs, and second, the actual manifestation of damage. Insofar as time is concerned, a disaster occurs at a single point, whereas a crisis can occur progressively. Meanwhile, in terms of the actual manifestation of damage, the material and immaterial losses from a crisis are imminent. While it is known that there will be some losses, it is not known for certain to what extent the damage has been or will be. In contrast, casualties and other indicators for damage are often immediately evident in a disaster. For example, when one refers to a disaster, both material and immaterial losses like loss of life and infrastructure damage are felt and seen immediately. If we try to visualize it, it can look something like this. A crisis is a segment with a lot of uncertainty, how it will turn out is unknown, and the extent of perceived damage might be asymmetrical with the actual damage. Meanwhile, a disaster is a point, possibly occurring at any point in a crisis. It is possible that a disaster precedes a crisis, or a disaster is the endpoint of a crisis. Take, for example, Typhoon Haiyan. It struck the Philippines in 2013 and is considered a disaster because the extent of loss was immediately felt, and because the timestamp of its entry and exit to the Philippines was known. However, the disaster could have been a trigger to impending health crisis, for example, an outbreak of gastroenteritis due to unclean water or dengue fever because of mosquitoes. It's also possible that a crisis ends in a disaster. Hypothetically, the Cuban Missile Crisis that occurred in October of 1963 could have ended in a disaster if two negotiating parties, the United States and former Soviet Union, did not reach a consensus. So why is this important for researchers? Simply because both are related but different situations that prompt different questions, and in turn, they require different answers. In research, we know that the manner of answering a question is achieved by a sound theoretical foundation and suitable methodology. So, as a disaster or a crisis researcher, it's important to note that while disasters and crises are inherently related, each of them have unique characteristics that set out the research design of a certain study. So, in the next session, we will look at the different methodologies used for both crisis and disaster research. We will also look at certain characteristics that make crisis and disasters different from researching non-crisis and non-disaster phenomena. The lecture ends here. I hope you had fun, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next session.